Thank you. First of all, I have to say that I did not choose this song, although I do like George Michael, but I was trying to remember what I chose. I did not choose any song at all. I also wasn't aware of the Braveheart clip, although being high imaginative and connecting things that are totally disconnected, I can tell you there is a link between William Wallace and Braveheart and some of what I will present here. If I don't mention it, please remind me in the Q&A. So another session on Millennials. This is probably the last thing you want to hear between now and the drinks. Hopefully, I'll share some insights from some of the research that was conducted by HCI and ICF, and bringing to life some of the psychological research that exists on generational differences. It is fair to say that few topics are as widely discussed in HR, talent management, as generational differences. And on the one hand, if you take a helicopter view of this and look at the big picture, this is totally absurd, right? Homo sapiens have existed for over 200,000 years. Even if you look at the wider time frame since the universe or the world as we know it existed, sapiens have been around for not even 2 minutes. And why then focus on such a granular and detailed aspect of human behavior, particularly if we're still not able to leverage our understanding of people in general to solve most of the problems that organizations have? Is it an excuse to actually dismiss the knowledge that we have on people in general, or maybe blame a particular generation that isn't even in charge yet for the problems that organizations have? Those are questions that I wondered myself. On the other hand, it is also true that even in fairly short periods of time, even in if you take time frames of 100 years, which in the realm of human evolution is a tiny fraction, there are visible changes in human behaviors, attitudes, and competencies. Whether you look at the world of fashion, art, communication, media, architecture, even music. Can you imagine, in 100 years, we went from Rachmaninoff to Justin Bieber? What will happen in 100 years from now that will make people look back onto Justin Bieber and regard him as an academic, intellectual kind of bastion of music, as we do with Rachmaninoff now? So evolution can sometimes devolve, but changes are remarkable. So in that sense, it makes sense to look at cohort differences. And some have argued that the cutoff points that we use to group or kind of lump people into buckets are somewhat arbitrary. They tend to be kind of driven not so much by actual population trends or kind of birth patterns of trends, but by historical events and really changes in what we could safely refer to as the consumeristic society. Okay, so led by ICF and lots of organizations, there's some really interesting research that you will have access to. Talk to ICF, and I will provide a link to the whole findings. There's about 40 pages summarizing the results. I'm only going to show you 2 slides with these results and then kind of move on, so that's the good news. But in total, 670 participants answered questions pertaining values, style, attitudes, and personalities that should hopefully help us understand how millennials and other generations should be managed, and even more importantly, how they will manage. I think from the perspective of readiness, if we're thinking about whom to promote, whom to invest in, it's very important to start looking at the bigger picture, not just as technical expertise. Great and well-known cartoon from the New Yorker assessing these issues. It's kind of remarkable that still in most organizations, potential is a function of past performance, and that mostly promoting people involves moving them away from tasks they do really well and putting them in roles that they're probably not so good at or not so interested in, right? So as the famous Peter principle suggests, everybody eventually rises to their own level of incompetence or mediocrity, right? So if you've been long enough in an organization, your potential is where you are minus one role, because if you're no longer worthy of promotion, you should have stayed where you were before, okay? So I think it's certainly from a coaching perspective and human capital perspective, it's a welcome trend and a healthy trend that people have now realized or become more aware as to the importance of soft skills. So let's look at a couple of the findings. First, what are organizations doing to attract, develop, and retain millennials? And in particular, what makes for an exciting or an enticing work environment for millennials? I'm upset that I missed Francesca Gino's presentation today. I'm a big fan of her work, and especially her work in the area of rebel talent. If you think about it, that's pretty much the paradigm that explains preferences in this generational cohort. What millennials want is flexible work arrangements, pretty much as those found in the gig or sharing economy. In a way, there's clear data indicating that comparatively to other generations, a higher proportion of millennials are interested in entering self-employment, or at least supplementing full-time jobs with other forms of employment. And if they can have flexibility within their full-time job, that's ideal. They also want more developmental opportunities. You know, everybody wants an opportunity to learn and unleash their curiosity, but for millennials, this hungry mind or thirst for kind of learning is higher. And they also are more needy in terms of recognition. They want to be recognized for the achievements. So in a way, it's a profile similar to that found in social entrepreneurs. They want jobs that enable them to have impact, make the world a better place, but also enable them to learn and have flexibility or freedom. What about values? And here I'm showing comparison between millennials and Generation Z, so we're already talking now about the next generation, and I was just talking to some colleagues during the break, and I said we probably have maybe 1 or 2 years of millennial bashing, and then millennials can start bashing the next generation, you know. So not long to go, particularly if you're millennials in the room, then you can take revenge soon and talk about the next one. But there are important patterns here. Sometimes what we attribute to one generation is simply a continuation of a trend that can be seen throughout the last, let's say, 10 decades or so. So in blue and kind of a lighter blue, you have Generation Z, or also called the Homeland generation, and all millennials. Some counterintuitive findings from the surveys. So they actually prefer to work with people who are higher in tradition and respect authority, so they are more hierarchical in their value preferences as to what type of cultures and organizations they want to work in. They also don't care that much about values alignment, working in a place that kind of exposes or where the culture is congruent with their own values. They also don't care that much about whether there is a transparent path to leadership or not. And most importantly, they want to be promoted very quickly. A couple of books that I can reference vis-a-vis this last finding. My colleague Ben Dutner wrote a couple of years ago a very good book called Credit and Blame, about how people, it's about organizational politics, but there's a very good section on generational differences in kind of entitlement and expectations at work. And on my flight here, I was reading one of the best books I read recently, Homo Deus by Yuval Harari. I really, really recommend this book. It's cynical and apocalyptic, so not something you'll pick up if you want to be cheered up, but he makes a really fascinating description of what he calls the modern age. He says, in the modern age, which is also the humanist age we're living in, the deal is very simple. We resigned to meaning in exchange for power. And all the progress in the world depends on the kind of closer symbiosis between science and business, which is transitioning sapiens to the next generations. We want to be immortal, we want to engineer happiness, and we want to consume as much as possible. But actually, we're giving up meaning in that sense. So if there is a trend here that suggests that people are becoming more transactional, more pragmatic, and perhaps even learning machines at work. That is in line with kind of the wider development of where culture is going in general. So I think it's important to try to draw some sociological insights from this. What does the wider psychological literature or science say in this? And Jean Twenge from the University of California, South California, has done a lot of work on generational differences. Some very important meta-analysis where she actually disentangles the effects of age and the effects of generations, drawing from interesting data that essentially you need to ask the same questions to people in the same age buckets through the times. Okay, so imagine we ask 20 or 30-year-olds the same question today and in the 80s and in the 50s, so you need to use archival data for this. Some very interesting findings summarized in this table. So on average, what she calls Generation Me, so millennials, tend to have lower levels of work centrality. So work is not that much of a central aspect or element in their lives, okay? There are obviously other lives, even if we spend more time working than socializing or with families or having fun, but this varies from generation to generation. Also lower levels of work ethic, and she also makes a very interesting distinction here that even though aspirations increase, work ethic goes down. That is one of the problematic kind of elements of what we sometimes refer to as entitlement. And at the same time, higher levels, dispositional levels of job satisfaction. So on average, they are more engaged at work. This is good news, especially if engagement translates into higher levels of performance. And then the one that has been discussed probably more widely, not just in her research and not just in US samples, but in general, individualistic tendencies going up. So individualism has been rising over the past 100 years. This echoes other findings by her and colleagues on the systematic increases in narcissism and entitlement over the past 8 or 10 decades. Some fascinating data, especially from the US, on what we call the NPI. This is the Narcissistic Personality Inventory. So it's actually used to diagnose clinical levels of narcissism, okay? Even though this might look like a minor change, is not trivial, it's strongly significant. And if you look at human dispositions, traits, or values, typically over 5, 8, 10 decades, you don't find dramatic or categorical changes. So to give you an example of the sort of questions that are part of this self-report inventory, I am destined to be famous. In the 1930s, something like 25 or 30% of people said yes, endorsed that item. In the 1950s, it was around 40, 45%. In the 80s, it was about 70%. Now it's 85%. Okay, so 85% of people in their 20s to 30s answer yes to the question, I am destined to be famous. Okay? And so that's interesting. I think even if you look at, we often assume that certain things are totally novel and a product of kind of current trends and culture and that they never happened before. And actually, it's important to look at things from a bigger perspective, right? Perspective. So even if we look at kind of the culture or phenomenon of trashy celebrity fandom, right? Like Kim Kardashians and Kanye West of the world. Like we tend to think it's like, wow, it's a sad state of affairs if we're living, in a culture or an era where if you want to be famous, it's almost better not to have any talents. If you have a talent, it's kind of, it works against you, right? If you're famous for doing something well, like, I don't know, Roger Federer or Serena Williams, it's boring. Whereas if you're just famous for being famous, wow. Or for having millions of followers, it's like, that's really something to embrace. And again, if you look at it from a kind of a more longitudinal basis or big picture perspective, first of all, there's nothing new. It's just that we habituate to certain things, and then we need inflation of certain traits to make something noticeable and actually to even react to that, right? So, do you remember Paris Hilton? But you don't see her very much these days, right? And it's interesting because in the late 90s or early noughties, it's like, oh, Paris Hilton, the generation of mankind, right? It's like, oh, who pays attention to this? And now, you know, she kind of looks quite intellectual, philosophical, compared to Kim Kardashian, who, by the way, she mentored, right? So from a mentorship perspective, it's like a good example of the disciple being better than the master, right? And if you go back to the 50s and you look at, you know, celebrities then like 50s, 60s, Marilyn Monroe, yes, she would feature in Playboy, but Playboy had, you know, Nobel Prize winning writers of literature writing their contributors. So I think it's important to look back and see the connection, and also think, where are we going? You know, again, where are we going? Much like I said, who will be the Justin Bieber equivalent in 100 years? You know, who will be the Kim Kardashian of 100 years from now that will make us look back at Kim as a kind of bastion of intellectual brilliance and metaphysical insights? So let me just say a few more things on this narcissism phenomenon, which I think is very interesting. And you know, I think in psychology, one could argue to a certain extent that it's all footnotes to Freud, or at least, you know, if you find something that is relevant, whether we're looking at organizational psychology or human behavior in general, Freud probably wrote about it, right or wrong, data-driven or intuitively. And Freud, of course, wrote a lot about narcissism, and especially about the connection between narcissism and leadership. I think this is something that is interesting to reflect on, especially if the question, if we accept that some of this is true and it's representing a meaningful change in average dispositions, right? We're not saying everybody is narcissistic. There's always a normal distribution. People are low, most average, some high. But this means that scores are shifting to the right or to the left in some traits. If we accept that on average, generations and people are becoming more narcissistic, then the question is, how should we manage those people who on average are more entitled, more individualistic, care less about working hard, and expect to be promoted more? And secondly, how will those people manage and lead? You know, and I think that is a valid question. That is a valid question, and there's sufficient data to justify that question. And so I want to go back to Freud here. About 100 years ago, he wrote a very interesting essay on leadership and narcissism. And Freud saw a very direct connection between the two. He basically said, well, you know, ascribing to an evolutionary view of leadership, he acknowledged that leadership is an essential function, an essential psychological process that enables people to get along in order to get ahead, right? So if you put people together and you give them a task, if those individuals want to work as a high-performing team, they need to get along with each other in order to get ahead of other teams. So essentially, Freud said leadership is about inhibiting or suppressing individuals' narcissism. If you can at least temporarily extinguish the me mindset that characterizes individuals at various points in time, then they can be more other-oriented, other-focused, and work as a high-performing way. So obviously that will be harder if you have people who on average are more narcissistic. It will be harder. I'm a soccer fan, so I used to use as an analogy Real Madrid, who for many years was obsessed with winning the European Champions League, and their approach was to hire all these overpaid divas who were all A players, and they couldn't function as a team. Now, Paris Saint-Germain is in the similar kind of unfortunately, Real Madrid has won a lot of trophies recently, so I can't use that analogy anymore, but they also changed their strategy. So it's clear that it will be harder to turn a group of people into a high-performing team if people are inherently more narcissistic. And as to the question of how they will lead, that's even more problematic. How are you going to get a leader to not be self-centered and worry or care about the well-being of the team if they are more narcissistic. Can we, one solution, of course, is that they achieve something great through their teams, but if they're so obsessed with themselves and so focused on themselves that they don't care about the well-being or welfare of the team, and they can't empathize, and they're very focused on themselves, then that's going to be harder. Okay, so I think those will be, they're probably deeper lessons than the ones we extract from typical or popular conversations on millennials. I know that it sounds a little bit depressing as well, but you're going to have a drink soon, so maybe just take something stronger when you reflect on it during the drinks. And so if you want to find out more about this, here are a couple of links that I wanted to show. You can access the full findings, right, from the research here. So if you want to unleash the inner geek inside you and go through the data, there's a lot of results. I only wanted to show you a couple in my slides. And we do have time for Q&A, comments, or observations. So thank you very much.
Could you just repeat what the book was that you're reading on the plane, or?
The book, yes. So it's by an Israeli historian. He's called Yuval Noah Hariri, and the book is called Homo Deus, so God, man. His previous book was a bestseller, Homo sapiens. That's a brief history of mankind. Homo Deus is a brief history of the future. I mean, it's profoundly apocalyptic and cynical, so... Yes?
It sounds like you're saying the tendencies now are stuck and fixed. Do you think they're going to change as these millennials have families, grow up, get used to working with other people, things like that?
Great question. And, most data is not sufficiently sensitive to that, including, the 40-page findings that you will read. I mean, really look at age differences. Of course, people in an age are millennials now, but how will they change? Now, some of the other findings, for example, the table from Jean Twenge, that actually disentangles age and generation, because they look at people from the same age at different points in time. And then we also have a second source of evidence, indirect source of evidence, to answer that question, which is that typically values don't change that much through the life course. Personality changes more. We become more introverted, more emotionally stable, more agreeable, less open. We become more boring, basically, as we grow older. But from a values perspective, other than people becoming being kind of more conservative when they're older, and everybody is a hippie and wants to save the world when they're younger. I mean, that's the kind of normal trajectory. Values don't change that much. So it's a great question. Yes?
So you have described the current state of affairs really well, but can you propose any solutions, or do you see any way out?
Look, I think, I mean, I don't think that we need to look at this and find a generic solution. That would be more at the level of kind of socio-political interventions or governance. And I'm a big fan of actually decoding the individual, So these are interesting kind of data to understand potential group-related changes. I always say, again, to remind you, there will be people with all sorts of profiles, traits, values within all generations. And in fact, it's interesting, I think, that we're allowed to make any remarks about generations, but you wouldn't be found making those remarks about gender, ethnicity, nationality, etc. If you do that, you'll be like, oh, you're prejudiced and stereotyping. Well, we are stereotyping about generations as well, but that's okay, because there's people of all, sorts of demographics there. So I think you know, I see this more as an intellectual exercise, and then it has implications for the big picture as to what should I do in my workplace, what should I do as a coach or as a learning and development kind of a professional. Be aware of it, but still personalize and deal with the individual and understand that it's people who are different more than groups of people that differ from each other. So the normal distribution is found. Yes?
Don't you find that as the work environment changes, that some of the things that millennials want, Gen Xers also want, and baby boomers also want? I think I saw a stat that the average person that works from home is age 47.
Yeah, so I think, you know, but I think it's interesting to think about what drives those changes. You know, I think we often assume, okay, so suddenly the environment or the context changes, therefore people will change. Someone is driving those changes, and I think those changes often respond to changes in psychological qualities, values, etc. It's much like when people say, oh, well, is Facebook to blame for, or should we blame Snapchat for increases in narcissism? Well, no, if we were narcissistic in the first place, these companies wouldn't exist, right? Because we wouldn't care about what somebody's cat had for breakfast, and they wouldn't post about it, you know? I mean, really. Just remembered Mel Gibson in Braveheart. Yes. What else? Yes.
So we've been talking a lot about how companies are kind of changing their leadership to a focus on social responsibility. It kind of sounds like there's a contradiction if millennials are narcissistic.
Yeah, I agree.
Are we
rhetorical question?
Okay,
or?
so is that?
I agree with you.
I mean, are we headed in the right direction if we're focusing on social responsibility?
I mean, you know, I think the bigger picture here is how some things become it works in two ways. You know, I think in the last 10 years, we often see HR or talent management practices hijacked by PR and marketing. So we're reinventing culture, we're abolishing this, we're doing that, and quickly these thoughts spiral, and then we assume that somebody has made a data-driven decision to create something that actually works for people, and then you find, oh, well, the data actually shows something else. Yes, but you know, does it matter? I mean, I think you're right on point. Yes?
Are narcissists convinced that they need to be coached? And how do you do that? And is that possible?
Okay. And you reminded me, there was a study published a couple of years ago on the quickest way to spot a narcissist, and it was a one-item narcissism test. And the question was, first, it's like, well, narcissism is a psychological disorder characterized with excessive self-focus, low empathy, and megalomaniac fantasies of grandiose talent, and blah, blah, blah. Are you a narcissist? And narcissists say yes, and they're proud of it, okay? However, that self-awareness actually runs counter their willingness to be coached, because they think they can back it up, you know, with their talents. And if self-awareness is not just one of the most important outcomes of coaching, but also one of the essential requirements for coaching to take place and for people to have coachability, it's going to be rarer there. And you know, you can think about heads of states and presidents that epitomize this, not mentioning anyone specifically, because people sometimes get upset. Yeah. So just Mel Gibson, right? There is a connection. If anybody has been to Elgin or wherever in Scotland, I think it's Callendar, where Mel Gibson, because he's such a Scottish fan, although he's Australian-American, but he identifies clearly as a Scotsman, and produced this movie, which is a nice film, I have to say, donated a statue of William Wallace to Callendar. But the statue is of him. And the locals are really pissed off. You know, it's like this Hollywood star, first of all, he can't do a Scottish accent at all, and it's a 3-hour film of him, you know, impersonating us and our hero. And then he erects a statue of himself here as William Wallace. So narcissism, right? That was the connection. Thank you very much.